Julius Malema's voice has shaken global politics in 2025, making him impossible to ignore. His bold defense of South Africa's right to self-determination and his fierce approach to land reform have put him at the center of heated international debates. Malema isn't just speaking for the poor in South Africa anymore, he's calling for a united Africa that stands tall against old powers. This new assertiveness has triggered a wave of diplomatic tension. World leaders, including Donald Trump, are wary of Malema's influence and his calls for economic independence that challenge U.S. interests. Every speech, every rally, draws sharp lines and ignites strong feelings. Malema's ideas are creating both hope and fear on the world stage. Julius Malema's rise, from local opposition to international spotlight. Julius Malema's journey from township rallies to global headlines is electrifying. As the leader of South Africa's Economic Freedom Fighters, EFF, he transformed a local voice for economic justice into a force that grabs attention from world powers. His relentless push for land reform and national pride touches nerves at home, but it's his willingness to challenge international elites that has truly elevated him. Every confrontation, every bold statement, these are the sparks that have made Donald Trump and others take notice. The Economic Freedom Fighters' broader impact. The EFF stands out as more than a political party. It's a radical left movement with goals that reach far beyond South Africa's borders. EFF's ideology is built on three pillars. Economic justice. The EFF pushes hard for public ownership of land, banks, and strategic industries. Their vision is rooted in socialism and anti-imperialism, calling for redistribution of wealth and land that were seized during colonial rule. Pan-African unity. Malema and the EFF consistently call for a united Africa, free from exploitation and outside control. They see themselves as the vanguard of a broader anti-colonial resistance that stretches across the continent. Radical resistance. They reject slow reform. Instead, they demand sweeping, fast change, even if it means direct confrontation with economic and political powers. The EFF is a master of mobilizing the youth. Open-air rallies, relentless social media campaigns, and bold uniforms signal belonging and pride. By painting themselves as the true defenders of ordinary South Africans, they have tapped into deep frustration and hope among young people, many of whom see their future chained by past injustices. The EFF's rhetoric blames ongoing poverty and inequality on a political culture still shaped by colonialism and white minority rule. They emphasize that their fight isn't just about local interests. They actively seek alliances with other movements in Africa, positioning themselves as a model for anti-imperialist struggle worldwide. Strategies set by Malema and his team include 1. Disruptive parliamentary tactics, challenging the ruling party by any means, walkouts, protests, or even song, forcing South Africa and its lawmakers to pay attention. 2. Media mastery, turning every statement, every accusation, into a headline that pushes their core message near and far. 3. Global messaging, using international platforms to broadcast EFF principles, framing themselves as the last line of defense against what they call economic imperialism. Malema is not shy about painting the EFF as protectors of the poor against both local elites and global corporations. The EFF's declaration that Africa is not for sale resonates with millions still wrestling with the legacies of exploitation. Land reform and national sovereignty. At the heart of the EFF's political storm sits land reform, Malema's unbreakable commitment and the cause that catapulted him to worldwide scrutiny. Malema doesn't mince words. Land must be taken back from those who stole it, without compensation. This stance has escalated tension both at home and abroad. His calls for expropriation without compensation challenge the global status quo. Western governments, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, have loudly opposed these plans, claiming they threaten stability and property rights. But Malema sees these criticisms as classic tactics, powerful nations protecting their own interests by masking them as concerns for justice. Malema's framing of the debate is powerful. He insists, historical justice matters. Land reparations aren't just economics. They're about righting centuries of theft and violence. National sovereignty above all. Attempts by foreign leaders to slow South African land reform, Malema insists, are examples of imperial interference and disrespect for African self-determination. Rejecting Western narratives, he's vocal in opposing stories pushed by Western media about white farm violence. Malema says these reports are exaggerated, designed to build sympathy for former colonizers and undermine the fight for economic justice. Every time Malema stands his ground, he reinforces his image as a leader not just for South Africa, but for oppressed people everywhere. His defiant stance wins admiration from other African leaders and activists, who see in him echoes of famous anti-colonial fighters. Draws sharp criticism and even fear from Western powers, especially when he accuses them of meddling in South Africa's affairs for their own benefit. Fuels global debates about sovereignty, reparations, and the future of former colonial states. For many South Africans, Malema's fight for land evokes the promise of the country's liberation, unfinished business that needs urgent attention. For his opponents in the West, he's a reminder that colonial history isn't settled, and global power structures remain contested. Malema's rise from protest leader to a voice heard in presidential briefings and international newsrooms proves one thing: South Africa's battles over land and justice don't just shape one country, they ripple across the globe, forcing old empires and new powers to take notice. Donald Trump's public confrontation with Malema. The 2025 public clash between Donald Trump and Julius Malema was not just a meeting of personalities, it was a collision of political worldviews broadcasted for all to see. Trump staged a dramatic Oval Office ambush, brandishing selective, inflammatory video clips to paint South Africa as a powder keg of anti-white violence. Malema, known for his sharp rhetoric, found his words and actions thrust into the global media spotlight, sometimes twisted, always scrutinized. This confrontation didn't just feed headlines. It triggered waves of support and outrage across continents, highlighting the heated battle over who gets to define the truth about race and power in South Africa. Both Trump and Malema reached millions online, showing just how powerful media weaponization and social platforms have become in modern political fights. Weaponizing media and propaganda. When the world's eyes turned to the Oval Office in May 2025, Trump seized the moment with calculated showmanship. He lowered the lights, rolled out provocative videos, and pointed an accusatory finger at South Africa's leaders, with Malema at the epicenter. The clips Trump used were old, discredited, and taken out of context. He showcased Malema singing "Kill the Boer," a struggle song upheld by South African courts as free speech, and footage of protest crosses he claimed were mass graves for murdered white farmers. Trump's narrative pushed the idea of a white genocide in South Africa, even though both courts and crime statistics disproved this claim. He ignored evidence showing that violence affected all communities, with most victims being black South Africans. These dramatic media tactics weren't just about South Africa, they resonated with Trump's core supporters in the U.S., stoking racial fears and bolstering far-right narratives. How Trump used media as a political weapon. Cherry-picked video clips and images to fuel outrage and fear. Shared false stories and conspiracy theories on his social media platforms. Used high-profile White House meetings and symbolic guests, like South African golfers, to create the image of a crisis. Malema and the EFF, for their part, were quick to respond. They harnessed their massive social media following to call out Trump's manipulation and reassert their own message of economic justice and anti-colonial resistance. Malema used live streaming, press statements, and global hashtags to challenge the White House's false portrayal. The EFF framed Trump's attack as the latest effort by Western elites to silence African radical voices. Both leaders understood the power of viral messaging. Trump mobilized his base using scare tactics and disinformation. Malema rallied allies worldwide, turning attacks into calls for solidarity. Their online war of words drew millions of views, proof that, in today's politics, influence can spread at the speed of a trending tweet. A clash over racial narratives and global influence. The Oval Office showdown unveiled a deep, global divide in how race and power are debated. Trump played to white nationalist anxiety, presenting himself as a defender of Western civilization under threat. His warnings about white genocide echoed far-right forums and were welcomed by white nationalist groups abroad, eager for their worldview to get mainstream endorsement. On the other side, Malema stands unwavering. He speaks the language of anti-imperialism, insisting that Africa's independence means reclaiming land and dignity from those who benefited from centuries of dispossession. His bluntness is matched by tactical skill. He frames land reform not as revenge, but as justice for the dispossessed. He ties South Africa's fight to broader African liberation, drawing from the legacy of leaders like Mandela. He encourages Pan-African unity in facing down external meddling and misinformation. This ideological split doesn't just spark debate in Africa or the United States, it has ripple effects far beyond. White nationalist groups in the US and Europe amped up Trump's warnings, using them as proof that their fears about replacement and decline are real. Anti-imperialist and Pan-African networks saw the confrontation as affirmation that their struggles are still threatening enough to unsettle Western powers. A single confrontation between two headline-grabbing figures became a mirror for wider anxieties: the fight for global influence, battles over land and history, and the never-settled question of who gets to define the truth about race in a post-colonial world. This frontal clash forced the watching world to decide: do we listen to the voices pushing fear and victimhood, or those calling for justice and self-determination? As long as social media amplifies every word, leaders like Trump and Malema will keep turning local disputes into global flashpoints. Why Julius Malema makes world powers and Trump uneasy. Julius Malema isn't just a firebrand on the South African stage. His bold stand against outside interference, his refusal to play by Western diplomatic rules, and his ability to turn local fights into international calls for justice have put the world's most powerful leaders on edge. Malema scares those who are used to having the loudest voice in Africa's future. In this section, you'll learn how his politics have redrawn the map for who gets to shape Africa's destiny and why even a heavyweight like Donald Trump feels threatened by his rise. Challenging Western interference. Malema's voice thunders against any trace of outside control in Africa. He doesn't mute his contempt for what he calls imperialist meddling pressures from the US, UK, and European Union that try to steer African decisions with threats or economic bait. He makes one thing clear: Africa's fate must be decided in Africa, not in Washington or London boardrooms. Several key points drive Malema's popularity with anti-imperialist movements across the continent. Refusal to bow to foreign pressure. Malema calls out Western aid cuts, sanctions, and warnings over South Africa's land reform as deliberate strategies to keep African countries weak and dependent. Outspoken solidarity. He openly backs revolutionary leaders elsewhere, whether it's defending Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré or voicing support for Palestine. This wins him respect from activists fighting Western-backed governments across Africa and the Middle East. Rejecting Western narratives. Malema decries US-led media stories about white genocide in South Africa as scare tactics. He accuses foreign leaders of twisting the facts to distract from the real issues, like deep-rooted land inequality and the lingering scars of colonial rule. Direct challenges to US power. By slamming US intervention in the UN and aligning publicly with countries like Russia and China, Malema unsettles Western diplomats who see these moves as destabilizing. His stance resonates not just in speeches, but in the data. South Africa's wealth is still tightly held by a small minority, mostly white, even 3 decades after apartheid ended. Policies pushed by Western advisors, Malema argues, have failed to deliver real change, so why act as if the old powers know best? By staking out this position, Malema becomes more than just a South African activist. He transforms himself into a symbol for anyone who wants to break free from old colonial ties, making him a headache for Western policymakers who must now answer tough questions from their own citizens about why Africa is still paying the price for a stolen past. The power of a defiant narrative. Malema knows how to take a local concern and turn it into a global flashpoint. His messaging is so clear and bold that his battles in South Africa spill over into living rooms in New York, Lagos, and Beijing. This is what makes him truly dangerous to the old order. He transforms every attack on his movement into a global debate about fairness, history, and who holds the power. Here's how Malema steers the narrative. Turning local struggle into global solidarity. When Malema stands up for expropriation without compensation, he frames it not as simple politics, but as justice for a continent robbed by colonizers. His words aren't just for South Africans, they strike a chord with landless people in Zimbabwe, peasants in Brazil, and even urban activists in the US. Challenging Western assumptions about race and power. Malema doesn't shy away from addressing race directly. He goes head to head with old colonial logic, making Western critics answer for their own histories of violence and exploitation. Making economic justice an international story, by connecting South Africa's land debate to global patterns of inequality, he energizes movements fighting corporate land grabs, economic sabotage, and resource theft everywhere. Weaponizing symbols and songs. When Trump tried to use protest songs against him, Malema doubled down, explaining their context as resistance, not hate speech. He showed that history isn't something to hide from, it's fuel for new battles. This approach unsettles world leaders used to polite, quiet diplomacy. Malema's words, amplified by social media, force global audiences to confront ugly truths about the past and ask who benefits when Africa gets told to wait its turn. His refusal to apologize, his use of language that calls out injustice without filter, and his insistence on connecting local and global history turn every policy argument into a fight with worldwide spectators. For leaders like Donald Trump, who thrive on controlling the narrative, this is a nightmare. Malema's rise exposes how much the old order depends on keeping Africa divided, silent, or grateful for scraps. By stepping into the global spotlight with no fear, Malema gives movements everywhere a rallying point, and shows that Africa's destiny can't be managed from outside any longer. Julius Malema's rise signals a deep change in how global power and justice are discussed. By refusing to let Western leaders dictate terms, Malema forces the world to confront the unfinished business of colonialism and economic injustice. His open fight with Donald Trump shows what's at stake, the old guard's grip on narratives, and the growing demands for a fairer future. Malema's international influence now stretches far beyond South Africa. His unapologetic calls for justice challenge old systems everywhere, daring new movements to speak louder and push further. The world is watching, and the ground is shifting. Malema's story reminds us that debates over land, dignity, and freedom can no longer be silenced or spun, no matter how much that rattles those in power. Thank you for watching. If these issues matter to you, join the conversation, share your thoughts, and help keep the spotlight on who gets to decide the future.